I'm thrilled to be here this morning. Thank you again, Mark, for the introduction. I'm going to talk about a number of things, but I'm going to talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about, and that is how do you understand networking for innovation? And I don't mean the networking, that we talk about a lot of times in HR in regards to how do you get to know people. I'm talking about organizational network analysis and what we are now learning with new science in order to better understand how ideas flow across organizations. And it all started with this question. Why is it that some ideas garner organizational attention and momentum and manifest into marketplace innovations, and yet other ideas that may seem to be equally fit to those ideas that are commercially successful do not take hold? That was what we were interested in, and we went into organizations and we snowballed through successful innovations, who created it, how did it happen, and we built a story across each of those organizations that we interviewed. What we found out, and I'm going to share a number of things that we found out, is the first thing was organizations are highly proficient at predicting their own demise. Think about what I just said. Organizations are actually highly effective at predicting their own demise. They just aren't so good at preventing it. Case in point, Kodak. This is a real-life story. Last year, 2012, Kodak filed for Chapter 11, a 131-year-old company that was at the top of the game, known for photography, created it, and certainly dominated the marketplace, for 131 years, filed for bankruptcy. That's not the story inside the story, though. The story inside the story is they actually invented the very device that destroyed itself as Kodak. So 1975, invented within Kodak's R&D department. I picked this one in particular. You might guess why. Within Kodak's R&D department, they invented the first effectively working digital camera. Steve Sasson, an R&D researcher inside the lab, invented it. It's a little big, you might argue, right? It actually weighed 8 pounds, and I think it was 0.01 pixels. So it wasn't exactly, the phone on your iPhone today, or the camera on your iPhone today, but it worked. It worked. And when Steve invented this, he took it to the technical professionals within Kodak, and what do you think they said? Wow, it's brilliant. Wow, you did that? That's fantastic. That's great. Then he took it to management. What do you think they said? Direct quote. Isn't that cute? Direct quote. Isn't that cute? Why? Why such a diverse response to that particular invention? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about that throughout this presentation. But that's not the end of the story. Not only did they invent the impetus for their own demise, but they also went out and conducted a study in the early 1980s. They did a disruptive technology future study commissioned from within Kodak. What do you think that study said? Digital cameras are going to destroy our film business. The bad news is our business is going to be demised. The good news is we've got at least 10 years to figure it out. What happened in the next 10 years? Anyone know? Nothing. Nothing. The study was wrong. It was actually 15 years, not 10, but it didn't matter. The 5 extra years had no bearing on Kodak's response. Fact is, Kodak did nothing. This is what Clayton Christensen would oftentimes call the innovator's dilemma. Why did they do nothing? You can't blame them for this. And there are many other organizations that do the same thing. Why did they do nothing? Well, because they held 90% of the film market share. Not only that, but the film market share was still growing at the same point that this future study was predicting its own demise. The film industry, you can see this graph, 1995 was still growing. So that study was commissioned in the early 80s. It didn't peak out until 2000, and then look at what happened. It crashed. It went off the cliff, and Kodak wasn't prepared. This is the story of many organizations. What we discovered in our research is that in all these organizations we went to visit, there were a handful of things that were always true. Number one, every organization had a heavy administrative structure. What does that mean? Formal processes, practices, and procedures to get work done. By the way, critically necessary. I oftentimes call this the innovator's hypocrisy. You know, all of us in the room hate this stuff. Let's just admit it, right? We hate the administrative formalities that we have to embark upon and go through in order to get new ideas, you know, through the system. Reality is, without it, you can't be commercially successful. So it is an absolute necessity for successful innovation, and every organization has it. The next thing that every organization has is an entrepreneurial system. Call that the local system where ideas are generated. It could be deep inside the organization. It could be at the top of the house. But it's a local entity where ideas are being shared, generated, learnings are being discovered, and it's almost always in small groups and face-to-face. What every organization didn't have, but the more successful ones did, was something that was called the adaptive response. The adaptive response was the ability of an organization to pull ideas from here, the first working operational digital camera, into here. The administrative systems necessary to get it funded, marketed, and deployed out to the marketplace. The organizations that were brilliant at innovation figured out how to create an adaptive response. A couple other real quick surprises, because, you know, again, they were provocative to us. We started with a commercially successful idea or innovation in the marketplace. We asked this question: who invented this? Who created it? Who was part of the team? And then we snowballed that the whole way back through the organization. You want to know something that was really interesting to us? We could almost never find the originator of the idea when the innovation was successful. Not whenever it sat on the shelf, like in Kodak's case, but whenever it was successful in the marketplace, it was almost impossible to find the originator. Second big discovery: it was almost never a single person in the first place. In fact, it was not even a single idea. It was a collection of a multitude of ideas whenever something was really successful in the marketplace. Third big aha was sponsorship always came later in the process, not earlier in the process. In other words, if you invited the big boss in first, you probably weren't as successful as if you waited until it developed, designed, you incubated it, built it, and then went and found sponsorship. And I'm not saying do something covert. There's a certain degree of sponsorship that's necessary just to get started. I'm talking about the sell, the pitch, going and getting funding, going and figuring out how to make this happen. Those were three really big ahas for us as we looked at this. Social scientists have been telling us for years that beneath the formal organizational charts of any organization lie a hidden web of social interactions that we rarely talk about. This is where work gets done. Work doesn't get done through the hierarchy. It gets done through local exchanges. What we found in our research is it is in fact the network, your social network, the network of this organization that actually pulls ideas that are generated in the local entrepreneurial system with small groups of people into the formal administrative systems that are necessary. Absent this network, what we call the adaptive response, absent the ability of connecting and interacting with people face-to-face and linking up and connecting to bigger business problems, it's almost impossible for organizations to create at least bottom-up innovation. The adaptive response is really based on clusters, not hierarchies. Ideas are created locally, but they adapt globally. And then finally, think brokers, bridges, and mixing chambers. Brokers, bridges, and mixing chambers. How do we navigate across the network more specifically? So let me go into more detail. Ideas spread in clusters for sure. Leaders are not always great sponsors early on. And I'm going to keep reiterating that because there are studies that show that. Finally, think of groundswells. How do you influence people from the bottom up? And you know, this is a cluster study. I talked a little bit about the obesity study. This is one on smoking. This is basically a cluster in Argentina of smoking patterns. If you want to influence this network, what do? Put on a campaign, anti-smoking campaign, or go tap into one of these clusters. What we know now is that if you can find your way into one of these clusters, you can find your way into that network, you will more likely be able to influence and affect behavior within that cluster than any place else. And I'll share more and more about that as I go through this presentation. Why are leaders not the best early in the innovation cycle? Because they're consumed. It's no fault of their own. They're simply consumed. They don't have the time to spend on your project that you do. They can't get as passionate about it because they've got 35 other things on their plate right now as well. So frankly, they're consumed. If you look at these gray bubbles, these light blue bubbles at the top, what this chart measures is the collective rating of individuals as a critical source. Leaders are a critical source of information because they connect across multiple silos, if you will, and individuals desiring greater access. These folks are consumed. The size of the bubble is the degree of engagement on a given activity. Notice the people deeper in the organization, their bubbles are bigger. What does that mean? They've got more time to focus on it. So at best, if you get a leader's buy-in early, at best, you're getting lukewarm support until something else big pops up, and then they're not going to support your thing over some other thing. So what I'm suggesting to you is find a way to make it their own, find a way to make it their bubble, grow their bubble, get them engaged, tap into their passion point, and you can do that later better than early. But you do, and it's really important that I keep iterating this, you do have to connect it to the business goals. You do have to connect it up to common purpose. You do need to get intentional about finding resources, and you do need to think about who are the key influencers across the network. If you don't experience conflict at some point in your quest of growing your idea, it's probably not going to be a breakthrough. It probably falls right dead on the average of other stuff you're inventing. So an early indicator of whether or not something's going to be breakthrough is, are people arguing with you about it? Have you created enough conflict? Now, conflict early, first stage, is bad because you can't stand up on your merits and everyone will pull the loose strings and all of a sudden you won't be able to counter-argue it. The conflict mid-stage is essential to the fitness of an idea. So go find conflict. Who dissents? The leader conflicting early on is not a good thing either because they can decommission it very quickly. But if you go through the network and you find a few dissenters and you present your pitch to them and they tell you why it won't work, you can adapt it. You can respond. You can modify it. Google has a saying, don't kill it, morph it. And you can modify your idea to deal with their issue, and most likely you will have a higher fit idea that's more scalable, more aligned to business strategy and goals, and more likely to be a breakthrough success than without it. Diversity is really critical. The more diversity increases, the more likelihood that your innovation won't fizzle out at the end of the day, and there's research to emphasize and illustrate that, and I can talk more about it if you've got questions. Finally, go find the brokers. Go build the bridges. Go find the connectors. How do you link network to network to be able to create clusters and then networks or parades of innovation? And you do that by finding the brokers or building the bridges. Let me show you a couple. This is actually an R&D. These are 4 regionally siloed R&D centers. A lot of innovation happening across those, you think? Probably within. My gut is there's probably a lot of innovation happening in each of those clusters because they're very tightly connected, large social capital, most likely fairly constructive. Is there a lot of innovation happening across them? Why not? They're not connected. Go build bridges. Connect them. Go find, it doesn't have to be a ton of people. Go find a handful of people, and it's better, based on what I said before, if it's not always the leader. Why? Because other people have more energy and time to commit to things. Go build your bridges. Go find your brokers. And I'll give you one illustration, Lexar guitar strings. A young engineer by the name of David Meyer had an idea. And his idea had nothing to do with guitar strings. His idea was, I wonder if I could initiate and find a filament that I could put on my bicycle chain to reduce friction. Oh, by the way, David worked in a medical device facility in W.L. Gore. And W.L. Gore afforded him the opportunity to tinker with his time to figure that out because they knew that it would have commercial value to the company at some point in time. So David tinkered, and he created a filament. He tested it on his bike, and it worked. And he socialized, and he went out and he experimented on his own bicycle and found the small ensemble of innovators, 3 or 4, and they tested it and iterated it across time. What they found was, and they did launch it into a product called Ride-Ons, is that that wasn't the real big play. The real big play, after they tapped in and talked to musicians, one of which was in the ensemble, there's a real problem with guitar strings. Guitar strings tend to, the oil from your fingers tend to build up in the filaments and actually cause premature corroding and cracking of guitar strings and distortion of sound. And if you could find the right filament to put on the guitar string, chances are you could solve this problem. It's exactly what they did. 3 years later, through an ensemble of innovators that they pulled in 1, 2, 3, 4 at a time, they tested it, marketed it, went out and did ethnographic studies, probably in their evening cafes, sort of walk-arounds, on their own time, and then finally, and only then, they took it to the administrative systems and said, we need to fund this. This is a great idea. We need to market this. We need to figure out what the forecast for this product could look like. And arguably, it's the most revolutionary product to hit the music industry in the last 10 years. This is how Google does business. Eric Schmidt says that Google is a technocracy, where ideas come from everywhere, but the beauty of a technocracy is they start somewhere deep inside the organization, but the best ones bubble up. And the best ones connect with other ones, and ultimately they gain momentum. They create groundswells, and ultimately they find themselves into formal systems. And believe me, Google has formal systems. And once they bubble up into initiatives and business challenges and other activities, then and only then are they commissioned formally and adopted through a brilliant innovation policy.